Hello, and welcome to another episode of the FESPA podcast, Up Close and Personal, with me, Richard Askam, and my guests today, Colin Strong. Hi, Colin. How are you?
Hello, I'm very well, thank you, Richard. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's nice to see you. It's been a while. We were talking just before we came on air the last time that you and I were working together, and it was sort of right in the middle of one of many lockdowns.
Yeah, it was seems a long time ago now, but it wasn't actually that long ago either. So lockdowns do funny things to your sense of time and time
Do
passing.
and yeah, it's interesting that somebody said to me that we mark time by the things that we do. So
mm,
if you don't do anything, you can't
yeah,
actually mark time. And so this is why so many people are going, "Oh, I only saw you last week." No, it was three
yeah.
years ago. And that whole sort of that period of time has just disappeared from our consciousness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a strange phenomenon, but still we've managed to battle our way through it, and here we are.
Yeah,
So it's
emerge.
and good to see you again.
Likewise. So, Colin, you're joining me today in your professional capacity,
Hmm.
I'm hoping this is still true, head of behavioural science at IPSOS.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
So
So when my research is correct, that's a good start to any episode. So
excellent.
good. So Colin, I'm going to start by asking you the same question I ask of all my guests, really, just to kickstart the conversation today. What does personalisation mean to you?
I mean, at one level, it's pretty straightforward, isn't it? It's how do you go about adapting yourself to another person, and the understanding of their characteristics and how you can best reflect reflect those characteristics in what you're putting in front of them. Now, I guess there's sort of that opens up a lot of questions about what characteristics are you talking about, and how does that translate into what is it you're putting in front of them, and why would you be adjusting what you do based on who they are. But at one level, we all do this in everyday life, don't we? I mean, it's a certain marker of social skills and graces, frankly, that we seek to adjust ourselves to some degree to those around us, and it's part of how we all get on, and we all rub along together if we can all just sort of move around and take account of each other's needs and preferences and likes and dislikes and so on. So in some senses, I'd say it's very much a familiar part of human life.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I guess what's interesting, just listening to what you were saying there, is there's times when it works really well, and you get all the glory for the thought that you've put into something, and whether that's a gift from a personal perspective or business
Mm.
or just a gesture, that sometimes it works really well. Tell me, when have you seen it work really badly?
Um, I think sometimes perhaps we can be a bit over eager to personalize. We can perhaps sort of almost sort of overdo it if we're not careful. And that sounds a little bit odd, because of course we all like to we all like to be noted and to have provision made. But I think perhaps when it can not work so well is almost if you are personalizing in a slightly inappropriate way. It's just like, well, how did you know that about me? Or maybe that's a little bit too much detail. We hardly know each other. It's so I think there are those sorts of ways in which you can just imagine, like in everyday life, if it can feel a little awkward if you kind of read the social cues a bit wrong, and you haven't sort of got it quite right. I'm in Devon this week, as it happens, and in Devon, if you pass somebody on a country lane, it would be really odd not to say hello to them, and maybe you stop and you have a chat and you ask them about themselves, and and so on. If you're obviously, though, if I'm do that in my normal place where I live in London, and you did that on a tube, you're very rapidly kind of people move away from you, and I think, who is this
Yeah, they don't
person? Or
quite
they kind of
understand
like
that. Yeah,
look, maybe answer you in a slightly bemused fashion. But so it's, I think it's about context, and trying to understand that what's right for what context, and recognizing the human nature of context, and how that influences the way in which we engage with each other.
yeah. No, I think that's a really critical point, and you're absolutely right about context, because if you'd said hello to that person you walked down past in a lane in Devon, but then went over and gave them a hug, that would be a little bit. But
Yeah,
there's a
absolutely.
spectrum of behaviour, isn't there? Really, social grace is on one side, and at what point does that spill over into borderline stalking?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So perhaps we just need to think about these things a little bit in terms of uh, different types of relationship which you might have, and of course, we don't always have a deep and meaningful relationship with everybody that we come across. Sometimes it's a bit more of a transactional relationship, and that's fine. And sometimes people want a friendly relationship. And that's fine, but it's just trying to understand what the context is, and then adapt yourself accordingly. So I'd say that, in some senses, then if we can use that as a starting point for personalization, that gives us a notion of how best to think that through. If you're an organization seeking relationships or seeking to personalize with your customers, and potential customers, thinking about this in terms of a human relationship is not a bad starting point necessarily, to help us understand, well, what might be appropriate here.
Yeah. And I suppose it's also considering from the other side what the ideal outcome would be from that personalized approach. Because one of the, you mentioned transactional there, which is quite interesting, and I wanted to talk to you about, because obviously your field of expertise is consumer behavior. So when you have brands, retailers, big businesses that are wanting to show a more human side, shall we say, to their interaction with their customers, and they opt to go down the personalized route. Where do you think the barriers are, or aren't, to pursuing such a strategy?
I mean, I think I'd say that there's, knowing your customers is an important one, and maybe that sounds like a truism, but it can be quite easy to be sitting behind a computer screen and seeing all these details of your customers' behaviors in front of you, and think you know them, in a sense. And there, it's important just to think, well, okay, I know an aspect of my customers, but I don't necessarily, I may not necessarily understand their expectations and preferences in terms of how they want me to be with them. And so I think that there are kind of stories told about the importance and value of personalization, and I don't want to underplay it. I think there's an expectation of personalization. It feels like if you didn't have any personalization now, it can feel a little bit odd. But conversely, if you haven't really sort of thought through, well, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What are we trying to achieve with this? Are we trying to sort of do relationship build here, or are we simply in the business of offering products and services which will have that person may wish to purchase? It's I think it's kind of important and useful to your point, to think through, well, what is that, and are you are people on board with what that relationship looks like and is, and then how do we then go execute on that? So I think it's absolutely legitimate point, is that what are you trying to achieve with this? What's the goal of personalization? Because it becomes a sort of a mantra. We must do this,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it's like, well, what are you trying to achieve with this? And be really clear about that, I'd say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the what is fairly obvious. The how is reasonably obvious in the world that we now live in. It's the why question that brands, I guess, or anybody that's wishing to go down that route has to answer themselves, or ask themselves at the very least. One of the things I find quite interesting is that you still to this day, and it's where are we? 2023. That's 9 years since Coca-Cola did their landmark Share a Coke campaign, where they put people's names on their products, and I was very involved in that project. So it's I know more about that than anything. But I've always said that your name is the least personal thing about you. It's largely very widely available in the public domain. It only becomes personal and truly personalized when you drop down a level into sharing, or offering things that I know about you, a line from a song, or a photograph from a holiday, or anything like that. The degrees, I guess, and we're in this world, aren't we, of GDPR? We talked about this briefly before we went live. Where I guess brands over here are scared to death of doing something too personal in case they cross over that imaginary line of well, that's just a little bit creepy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the phrase which is often used in that context is uncanny valley, isn't it? So to what extent do we then, if we're, do you kind of get to a point where you're potentially a little bit creeped out by what you're seeing and what you're hearing and so on, and I think that point will vary depending, again, it's all context. It depends on the brand or the organization. It depends upon the individual and their comfort and willingness to hear that. It depends upon the what it is that you're talking about. Are we talking about the groceries, or are you talking about my health? Might be quite different things. So of course, it is something where there isn't one size fits all. I mean, just to give an example here, I suppose there's Spotify get a lot of attention from their Spotify Wrapped offer at the end of the year, and there's something clearly engaging about it, and quite fun, and it's very shareable, and there's a sort of flurry around people are saying, oh, let's see your Wrapped, and so on, and good for them. That works pretty well, it seems, but it is in a particular context. I know that my supermarket that I get online deliveries from did something similar, and it wasn't quite so exciting, seeing that I'd sort of what my top buy was, which I can't remember. Maybe it's hummus or something, and no one was really very interested in that. It's just like, I mean, so it's one of these things whereby it's just like no harm done, and of course we've got to try this stuff, and good for them. But it's it just made me think, look, what works in one context ain't going to work in another context.
Things we need to know versus things we don't need to know, isn't it really? And I guess supermarket shopping is a bit utilitarian in that regard, that doesn't really have any emotive nature to it, whereas songs, as we know, are one of the most emotive things going in all of our psyches.
True. Yeah, but
Spotting.
perhaps at the same time, what I might be interested in might be, how healthy is my shopping basket been, and how does that compare against other people's shopping basket, and what else could I be buying in order to make it healthier, or I don't know, I mean, and there's dangers with that, of course, because that can come across as quite patronizing if you're not careful, and a bit preachy. But perhaps it's also kind of interesting in that perspective as well. And so it all depends how you present that, I think. So yeah, there's clearly sort of different ways of doing things. But and obviously, look, a lot of this is really about how can I present stuff in a way which is going to be maybe there's sort of things that I can put in front of people that they would find more interesting based on their past purchases. And so a la Netflix or Amazon, of course.
Yeah, this is where that personalization becomes about data rather than, and again, I think we've got trapped a little bit that everybody thinks personalization is your name on something. And it isn't. It's just information that's conveyed to you that is personal to you that you may find interesting. And I guess the risk is that companies don't do it in case they offend the few, and in doing so, they miss out on pleasing the many. The wrap thing is a great example. I'm really interested to know, actually, Colin, if number one on your shopping list is hummus, what's number one on your Spotify list?
Do you know what? I don't actually. Oh yes, I do remember. There's a kind of French techno DJ called Rhone, which my teenage daughters found hilarious. Anyway.
I can't see the link between that and hummus, but there we are.
I don't know. Yeah.
You're listening to the Up Close and Personal podcast with me, Richard Askam, and my guest today, Colin Strong from IPSOS. And we're talking, Colin, really about where the line is with people in terms of, I like that you know that about me, to I don't like that you know that about me. I mean, obviously that's a moving for everybody, but for your purposes, where would you say your line is in terms of you don't want to receive something that's so personal about that particular subject? Where would you say that would be for you?
I guess it's all about value, isn't it? It's just like, am I getting value out of having shared this with you? And because clearly there is potential for you as the brand owner to be getting value out of something which about me. But where's my value? Where's what's the what am I getting from this? And I think that kind of notion of sort of value exchange is a key thing for us to bear in mind. What's the because it's all too easy sometimes if you're talking as a marketeer or indeed a sort of policymaker about what we can get from sort of engaging customers in this way and people and the populations in this way. But if you're sitting in the sort of shoes of the recipient, well, how are they going to see this? What do they want from this? What do they what do they feel is to be gained from having shared their data in this way? And do they in fact know that they've shared this data in this way is another question. So I do think it's that kind of question is absolutely critical. And as the data about ourselves, which is in the public domain, becomes perhaps sort of more widely available, I think these questions and more sensitive data about ourselves may become more widely available, like our health data, for example, then those questions I think are going to get asked a bit more. And with that, then we need to have a good story of, well, what is the value? Because I think when people start to see that their data is being used, then there's this thing called the endowment effect. We value what we have and what we consider ours, and the fact that that perhaps you're receiving something where somebody's used your data to their ends in a sense draws attention to the fact that you have this data which you may not necessarily have thought about before. And so as such, this kind of sparks something off in us. Well, hang on, that's my data. I didn't realize that this was being used in this way. And then you can't start to put a greater value on it. So in a sense, there needs to be a thought through mechanism of who's achieving what from this from this sort of personalization process.
And therein, I guess, lies the intrinsic risk and probably the reason why potentially 9 years on from Share a Coke, nobody really has done anything bigger or better than that for maybe the risk assessment of how we use your data might reflect back on us negatively for having used it in the first place. I mean, there's the famous example with the Coca-Cola campaign that they had 550,000 different names in their database that people could select their bottle or can from. The only one that wasn't in there was Pepsi. And you know, so their risk at that time was not your data, it was their competition. Fast forward to today, 2023, and I guess the biggest risk now is data abuse. Would that be reasonable?
I'd say that I mean, I think all of these things carry some level of reputational risk, don't they? You know, and so therefore it's really important to tread carefully in this space. I think we just need to just think through what that looks like, and it may not always be entirely obvious. Because it may be that what's happening is that perhaps it's just go back to the point I was making earlier about that it's a relationship. And so if you're a bit over familiar, then are you actually going to be turning somebody off a little bit? And let's face it, you don't know everything there is to know about that person. Of course, you can. You've got your own sort of understanding of that person, and also you've got third-party data assets. But how much of the story about a person can you really derive from their data? And so I think there is an element of just being a bit humble about how much you can really know about a person from the behavioral data that you've got about them. Because one person's behavior that you see on screen may be the same as another person's behavior, but the motivations and the attitudes and the thoughts behind those very same behaviors may be very, very different. And so therefore, I think we just need to just keep in mind perhaps whilst we keep in mind both the opportunities of personalization and the fact that there's an expectation of some degree of personalization, but also just to think through, well, look, where are the boundaries here? It makes it more powerful in my mind always if you think through what the boundaries are as much as you think through what the opportunities are, and where does it start tipping over and you're getting it wrong, and so on and so forth. So I feel like those are things which we really need to be considering.
I think that falls under the catch-all of just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is always a good mantra to have, isn't it, really? Colin, we're running out of time, but I just want to ask you this last question, really, and it's a bit of future gazing on your behalf. You know more about consumer behaviours than most. And so really post-pandemic, we said we were emerging back into a sort of a brave new world in a way, in some ways good and in some ways bad. But with regard to personalization across the spectrum as you see it, where do you see it going? I mean, I personally can't see it going back in the box. I think the genie is well and truly out of the bottle now in terms of expectation from consumers. But where do you see it going over the next few years?
I think in a way, there will be a tension between what of expectations. There is what do I, as let's say a brand owner, want to achieve from personalization, and how I then go about doing that, and what do I as a customer want from some form of personalization. And I think there's going to be some degree of renegotiation around what that is and what that looks like. So I would say that of course, we want personalisation. It's a good thing. It's generally welcomed. All the survey data suggests that people want this, and from the other side of the screen, then sort of brand owners and organisations are keen to offer it as well. But I'd say that the big challenge and opportunity is really just reconciling what that offers, what that means, what I get out of it, and how what that looks like. And I don't think that conversation has necessarily taken place as much as it needs to. And I think that's where we're going into that conversation now. And I've sort of seen this go up the agenda a lot recently, and I think we're in an interesting place and an interesting discussion. So it's a really good moment to be thinking and talking about these topics, because I feel like they are increasingly top of mind for all of the actors in this place.
Absolutely. And of course, the goal of the FESPA show, the personalization experience, is to bring all of those views inside the tent in Munich for 3 days in May, and hear from really all sides of that conversation and that discussion. If the timing is good for that conversation, let's be having it. Colin, I hope you can join us there in Munich for that event. But for now, Colin Strong, thank you very much for being my guest on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here. Thank you.